This week, it's a conversation with Kevin Kelly, co-founder of and senior Maverick at Wired Magazine, and the author of What Technology Wants on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I am your man of letters and sound waves, Colin Marshall, this week talking to Kevin Kelly, a co-founder of Wired Magazine and editor of Cool Tools. He's on the board of the Long Now Foundation, which I've always found very cool. He's the author of books like Out of Control, The New Biology of Machines, Social Systems, and the Economic World, New Rules for the New Economy, the photo book Asia Grace, Bicycle Haiku, and now What Technology Wants. Kevin, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's my pleasure and honor to be here, Colin. I'm a fan of your podcast, and I'm really glad that you're interested in the book.
Well, thank you for your interest. Of course, it's always, when you know that someone like Kevin Kelly listens, who has a choice. I mean, I can put it mildly. You have a pretty good selection of interesting people to talk to, right, and to listen to.
Yeah, I do, and I'm a big podcast fan. I spend a lot of time chauffeuring my kids, and so this redeems that commute time. Yeah, I'm pretty picky, and I really do enjoy the folks that you're interviewing because it's a great eclectic and not obvious choices, and so I'm really honored that you include me.
Well, thank you, and you know what really surprises me is I talk to a lot of people who write books on this show, and your book escaped a fate that a lot of their books did not escape, which was you got away from the scourge of the subtitle. How did you avoid that?
I have no idea. I just lucked out. But yes, you're right. The What Technology Wants has no subtitle, and I didn't have to do much persuading. So I think I was just lucky.
It's funny because, of course, the subtitle, I mentioned the subtitle for your earlier book, Out of Control, which is a pretty good subtitle as they go. But too often, the subtitles just sort of, they make extravagant claims or things that border on lies about the content of a book. But I find with your book, there's enough surprising stuff in here that you don't really have to lie about the content to make it striking. I mean, there's first of all this way you treat technology. You treat it like biology. You treat it as if there are many analogs, which there seem to be. You persuasively demonstrate the similarities with the way biological evolution and technological evolution. And I don't necessarily want to make you lay out all of your arguments here because, of course, you've laid them out in the book. But what do you find most interesting? What are some of the things you find most interesting about the ways that technology resembles biology?
That's a really good question. The book, What Technology Wants, and even my earlier book, Out of Control, posits that technology and nature are basically two different facets of the same kind of what I would now call exotropic system, meaning that these are systems that are autogenerative, that are persist in disequilibrium over long periods of time, that grow, adapt, evolve. It's very clear that technology has grown out of our minds, and we are biological and products of evolution. So that in that sense, technology is a product of evolution, and it is an accelerated version of evolution. And so what I look at is the ways in which not individual gadgets like your iPhone or antibiotics or refrigeration or an automobile are biological, but the ways in which the whole system itself, the interacting web of connections between all the different things that we make, including the internet, communication systems, and the roads and factories, and the ways in which it takes hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies to produce a new technology. They're kind of all codependent upon them. That whole thing, which is what I call the Technium, that is, in many ways, a lifelike system that exhibits many of the same properties that we see in evolutionary life. I have come to see that really, in the kind of abstract philosophical sense, that technologies, the technium, is very much like an ecology, an ecosystem of living things. And the benefit of that, I think, is that we can learn to embrace it and to use it and to manage it if we understand that it's really not cold and inert, but something that responds to us and has its own agenda.
This word technium, you mentioned it and you talk about in the book, coining it, and it's of course the title of your blog. And it seems like a very useful, evocative word for what you're talking about. And I wonder, it's sort of like you mentioned Brian Eno using the word scenius to describe sort of the genius of a specific scene of people. It's one of these words, I wonder why more people aren't using it yet. Do you know what I mean? Or is it just too new, do you think, to have gained currency?
Yeah, it's a word that I coined, so to speak, so remains to be seen whether others will adopt it. But it's a word that I don't like coining. Some people like to coin words. I kind of avoid that if I can at all avoid it. But in this case, there were really no alternative because the word technology does not bring to mind or does not connotate the interdependency, the kind of whole systems view that I'm trying to suggest. And some people say, well, you should use the word culture. What you're talking about is culture, because when I talk about the technium, I'm talking not just about the wires and the hardware, but in fact the intangible things like a calendar or double entry bookkeeping, or even the artifacts that we produce, like a book, content of the book, or even movie, and these and the kind of laws that we have generated. And someone say, well, that's just kind of culture, but the word culture again does not capture the idea that these things form a whole interrelated unity that exerts, like any complex system, exerts its own tendencies and urgencies. So that's why I kind of go as far as saying, well, it's not culture, it's not just technology, it's the technium, and it has an inherent bias to do certain things. And the question I ask in the book is, well, what does it want to do?
The idea of technology being a system, of it all coming together or being together as its own system. You talk to people about that, or at least I hear people talk about that, and typically they're framing it in very Terminator 2 style terms, where, well, if you take technology as a system, obviously it's evil and it's anti-human. Your conclusions are very different. Why do people think what they think?
I think that technology kind of follows several different courses. One is an evolutionary course where it's reinventing itself. And then the second one is sort of more of a developmental course. And let me give you an example, because obviously our human bodies have been evolved in kind of geological time. So there's change, from a primate to kind of humanoid form. At the same time, we individually experience change over time that's developmental. So we started off as an egg and became a blastoid and, a fetus, an embryo, and toddler. And so we have experienced developmental change. And I think in the course of technology, there has been in developmental stages when it was basically kind of like a toddler. The technology was often, I think some of the industrial technology was very hard to live with. It wasn't very humane. Factories, smokestacks, steel, chemicals. And I think that was sort of the terrible two stages of technology that we've gone through. But we are now seeing a new face of technology as it becomes more intangible, as the guts of it become more ecological, as we can see in the internet, where we can actually tame it a little bit more and make it more suitable and humane, more green. And sort of entered into a more, mature phase of development where a more mature facet and view of technology is visible. And we can begin to see that it really is not antagonistic to nature at its best. There are certainly plenty of examples where it's been misused and continues to be barbaric, but we can see the potential for it to be green and compatible with life. And there's really, and so I think it was fair for people to fear technology because it was brutal for a while, and the problem was people kind of, this was the problem of the 50s and beyond, was people kind of say, well, how bad it is now, as it gets more powerful, it will only become worse. It will be, computers will be the one big, gigantic big brother. But in fact, they went a different direction. And I think we're now only overcoming some biases that we have about a technological world, because once we see it more like an organic system, I think we can begin to see the beauty in technology.
It would seem that just looking around and seeing an iPhone, say, versus seeing the smog over Victorian London, it would seem fairly obvious that technology has become less harmful to us as we've gone along. But we're still at the point where you need to write a book like this to explain to people that, the smog is not over Victorian London anymore. We now have iPhones, we have e-readers, we have things that aren't hurting people quite so much. How did you come to the conclusion that even though the evidence is all around us, it needed to be put into this form?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what I'm trying to offer is, in some ways, a start on the idea of kind of a theory of technology. For me, the interesting thing about technology is that even though it surrounds us, even though we're kind of immersed in it, even though it's sort of overwhelming us in many ways, that we don't really collectively have a good sense of what it is. What is it? I'm trying to suggest maybe the beginnings of some answer to understanding its kind of role in the cosmos, and saying that, it's taking it beyond just sort of the face of it, which is just more gadgets in our pockets, more stuff along the road, more stuff in the air, and to say that there's actually, there's a bigger framework for understanding what it is, and that when we have that framework, it might help us to deal with the new things that we're making, trying to understand how we should relate to them. So I think there's the practical outcome of trying to articulate what it is that technology is that we will become better masters and servants of it. Because what I have to emphasize is that it does have its own agenda, and sometimes we are going to serve it, although other times we are the masters, but that tension will always remain. And so that, again, is part of this philosophy or this theory that I'm trying to put out and have us understand is the fact that we will always be in conflict about what technology is doing, because we will always be in a dual role of both being masters of it and slaves to it.
One of the things that I closed your book believing was that if you look at technology, if you look at the Technium, you're looking not at something necessarily separate from humans, but you're looking at us. You're looking at something that's now not extricable from humanity because we're reliant on it. It is reliant on us, and we're influencing one another. Is it correct for me to say that there's just no way to separate the humans of 2010 from the technology they've created?
Absolutely, you're correct. We long ago have become codependent, symbiotic, almost cyborgian with our technology. The little kind of visualization that I would suggest is, there was some tractor beam from another starship another galaxy coming down that could remove every trace of technology from the planet, including, knives made of bone, we would just be eaten by the other animals and collapse in starvation. We need technology, biologically need, because we've altered our bodies already to depend on things like cooking and tools to kill animals that we can't kill with our bare hands or grow with our bare hands. And so on that fundamental level, we depend on technology. And of course, as modern people, our brains are affected, are rewired by things like literacy, by learning alphabets, by our socialization, by language skills. They actually do change our brain. And so, again, at that basic level, we are dependent. In our civilization and any things that we kind of think are really good about humanity also depend on the fact that we've made this culture that continues beyond and outside of us. And so what we're doing now is, of course, we're extending and accelerating that. We're going to become ever more dependent on it. And we get a glimpse of that kind of dependency with the way in which we're depending on Google and being connected all the time, and the feeling that many people have, including many kids, that when you're offline, when you're taken away, when you lose your phone, when you are cut off, that it feels like an amputation. It feels like you're dead. It feels like you don't have your brain. And I think that will continue even more. That dependency will really become essential to our definition of the self. And I don't feel that that's a bad thing. I think that's just evolution. I mean, we invented language, and right now we literally cannot imagine ourselves without language. And I think most of us who grew up reading and writing really don't have any concept of ourselves without reading and writing. We would not be the same. And I think we're going to say eventually that without being connected to the exobrain that we're making, that we won't feel like we are really who we are.
Could I say that at first, we humans, we thought with our brains were just our brains. Then we thought when we invented language, we thought with our brains, but also our brains were the parts of others' brains we could access with language. And then written language came along, and we thought with our brains, but also all text we could read. And then we started thinking with books as well as our brains. Now it's our brains, all texts, and the internet that is our brains.
Yeah. I mean, this is Marshall McLuhan's, the extension, that the wheel was an extension of the foot, the hammer, the extension of the arm. And it's very clear that the internet is an extension of our brain. I mean, it's as clear as day. The difference is that I believe that this other thing, this internet thing, whatever it is not just an extension of our brain, but also together with us, it's forming a kind of super brain that will have its own agenda, or its own thoughts. Let me put it that way. I don't mean conscious thoughts, but that basically it's just not that we're extending our brain, but that in fact us and the extended thing form something new with its own tendencies and urgencies. And that's the difference, I think, is the difference between, say, the Technium and culture. It's not the culture, it's not the extension of us, but that it becomes so extended or becomes so rich and so complicated that it is something in itself. And that's the kind of the paradox of simulations. John Bajard and all these other guys who talk about simulations, is that sometimes the simulation becomes so rich that it becomes hyperreal, becomes something in itself. And at some point, the simulation of the world will acquire its own reality, not just an illusionary reality, but its own reality of some degree. And I think that's what I'm saying about the technological sphere, is that it's complicated, complex, deep, interrelated, evolved enough that it's something in itself, not just an extension of it.
Thinking in the framework of this argument, it leads me into kind of an interesting, sort of strange conclusion or dead end or something like that. First of all, I should say I don't have an iPhone for a few reasons. One of which is that I don't make any money at this, so I can't afford one. But another reason is that I don't want the internet to necessarily always be with me. And I think to myself, I can understand and accept that the internet is now as much a part of my brain as my brain, essentially. But at the same time, I value not having the internet at certain times or being able to close myself off from the internet. Of course, I value tapping into it greatly, but I also value getting away from it. But it's not as if I want to, at any point ever, turn off parts of my organic brain. Do you know what I mean? What's the difference there?
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I mean, I think actually it's very healthy to have sabbaticals from this. When I travel, I don't actually, like you, I don't have a smartphone. I don't currently have a laptop. When I travel, I try not to be connected as much as I am when I'm working at home, and which is where I work. And so I find it personally very healthy to disconnect, because I think there is a value in the Sabbath, and I think part of what happens is that it allows you to have a different perspective. In this kind of global economy where connection becomes really cheap, the things that are disconnection at times becomes valuable because you can permit yourself to think a thought that not everyone else is thinking. And so I think, I actually personally agree with and understand that motive to not be dependent on it. And there is a joy to building your own house with your own hands and to making fire from scratch or to make a meal from scratch. And what I see that is just more of the increasing possibilities that we have. Enforced, required, mandatory simplicity is nobody wants that. But when you have volunteer simplicity, when you can voluntarily have less or go back to the manual way of doing it or to be disconnected on your own as a choice, that's what we want. And there's kind of a highly evolved ease of being able to go from, making your own meal to ordering at the best French restaurant to anything in between. That's because what we all want is to have more choices, and we want to retain the old choices of being simple. So simple is just yet another choice. And I think that's good because we have more choices.
And certainly the multiplication of choices becomes a very important theme in your book. And as well, another theme I like a lot is you describe thinking about technology, or thinking about a lot of things, in fact, as essentially 51% good, 49% bad. The goodness just outstrips the badness. And I mean, that's good enough for me, considering, the situation humans have always been in. I'll take that 1% or less. I'll take 0.001%, But I think of the internet as being, the 51% good is really good, and we all know what that's like. For me, the 49% bad is how I can spend a lot of time kind of wandering through it and lose a lot of time doing that with little to show for it. And Paul Graham, the essayist and venture capitalist and programmer, wrote an essay recently called The Acceleration of Addictiveness, and he talked about new technology is coming out so fast that we don't know what's addictive until it's gotten us. And this resonated with me when I read your chapter on the Amish and how they have this very test it out, see what happens, and the elders will decide view of technology. It seems to me that this idea that this technology, especially internet-related technology, even though that sounds redundant these days, might be secretly sort of getting us in terms of time wasting and addiction and all that. That seems to be a theme that's kind of gotten into the zeitgeist lately. Do you find that as well?
So there's several things going on, and I don't in my book What Technology Wants, I don't really focus on kind of current technologies very much and the problems and benefits of the current stuff. I really try to take a little longer view of things, but you're right. there is right now a kind of reevaluation of what this stuff is doing to us. There's Nick Carr's great book on shallows and showing how people have difficulty reading long form, being immersed in this kind of constant, perpetual distraction, what do they call it, the constant partial attention and stuff. And so I do think that that is a factor. I think historically you can listen to the arguments about the arrival of the romance novel, which many people would want, would see as kind of the antidote to the internet, reading novels. There was great hand-wringing and all kinds of despair about what that was doing to everybody. People secreting off and spending hours reading alone. How awful! And I think and it's happened each time. I mean, even the arguments about writing in general and the loss of memory and the orality and the ability to memorize 5,000 line ballads, and that was true. So I think there is a cost to this new kind of literacy, and secondly, I think that we're not really very good at it right now. So I would say one thing is that yes, all this stuff is coming. It's a lot of distraction, but we've had it for 7,000 days, and I think it's just going to take us a while to learn how to really incorporate it, and we'll evolve some cultural standards and etiquettes about and understandings that we can teach. Because the thing about reading is that it actually takes a long time to really become literate. It takes years of very active education to learn the literacies of the alphabet and reading. And I think it's going to take some very deliberate practice in that term of the 10,000 hours of practice to really become masters of some of this new technology. And so I'm not as pessimistic about it. And then the third thing I would say about it is I kind of agree a little bit with William Gibson. He thinks that one of the fact that you waste time on the internet is actually one of his greatest virtues, and I actually agree with that. That playfulness is not productive by definition, and that there is a degree of just kind of walking in the woods for no reason at all, for just you're wasting time, but I think that's actually a good thing, and it's something that we often lose track of. That some of the best ideas and some of the best inventions and innovations and some of our best times of our lives are basically when we're playing. And that it doesn't have to be so productive all the time. That actually waste, in that term, that way, is actually very good for creativity. Creativity is not a very efficient process, let me put it that way. It shouldn't be. I mean, it's like you could say, well, Picasso, you're wasting time. You're painting a day. It's like, why don't you just paint one good painting a year? Okay, so I think that so I'm not so bothered by the fact that there's wasting of time, and I'm not so bothered by the fact that we don't have it all figured out right now, because to me, I think we can feel the advantages. I think we see the disadvantages, and I think we can learn to overcome them, and it may take more technology actually to overcome some of these addictive aspects of it.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Senior Maverick at Wired Magazine and co-founder of Wired Magazine, Kevin Kelly, author of What Technology Wants. If you have any questions, comments, feedback of any kind, send that along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you want to hear the show again or any other in the Marketplace of Ideas archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com, our official website. That's colinmarshallradio.com. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Kevin Kelly on the Marketplace of Ideas. Cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Are we, as people who remember a time before the World Wide Web as it's currently known, aren't we kind of like Are we kind of like people who lived through the invention of the alphabet, in that they probably struggled with the downsides of text and of writing more so than anybody born into a world with the alphabet? Do you think that, I mean, as much as this can be speculated on, people who were born after the web became the web will have a certain navigational advantage around the pitfalls that maybe, I mean, I barely remember the pre-web days, but I do remember them, and I find I fall into certain pitfalls. Do you know what I mean?
Yes and no, but here's my little bit of caution. Someone born today, or you were born, let's say 2,000 years after the alphabet was born, but you didn't sort of just wake up one morning knowing how to read. It took, you still had to be educated.
Right.
And even though it was 2,000 years later and writing is ubiquitous and pervasive around us, you still had to struggle with learning how to read. This just didn't come by osmosis. And I think that, just because kids today are born after the web doesn't mean that it's not going to require some education, some training to really master its right role in our lives. I think the idea that somehow we just absorb this without any kind of deliberate practice or training or education, I think is misguided. So, I mean, that's one of the things that is missing from the conversation is the fact that it's like saying kids are born, but they're not reading well because they've never gone to school.
Right.
So I think we're the reason why we don't have schools yet is because we don't really know exactly yet what these literacies are, what the skills that we want are, how we're still figuring it out. But I think as we do, they should be teachable, and we should be able to master them. And however, it's very evident because of acceleration that we're always going to be learning these. And so it becomes a lifelong learning project where, I mean, the problem is the alphabet's kind of stable, right? And it hasn't changed in hundreds of years, at least the one that we're having, I guess hundreds of years, maybe at least 100 years. And I learned the same, or my kids will learn the same alphabet that I learned. That's not true in the technological world. We're all going to be students all the time because once we master some set of skills, another thing is coming along and we have to become students again. And I think learning how to learn and learning how to learn new literacies and learning how to master new things, that will be the meta skill that will become essential to teach. Just because you know how to use the stuff today, in 10 years or when you're 50, you're still going to have to relearn everything again. And that's sort of the big lesson that we're learning right now.
Has education as traditionally conceived sort of ever been good at giving us the skills to navigate our world with modern technology the way it is, the way we'll have to readapt? I mean, has there ever been any kind of standardized preparation for this? Could there be?
No, I don't think there has been. I call it sort of techno-literacy, where this sort of understanding how the Technium works, understanding that, as soon as you buy something, it's obsolete, understanding that you want to wait till last minute, understanding that whatever you do, you're going to have to relearn it, understanding that there's a cost for every opportunity. There's a basic set of fundamental mastery of the Technium and living in this kind of highly accelerated change that we aren't teaching, that we've only begun to hint at in schools, and some of it's taking place in the corporate world where, they have ongoing training and they have help desks. And I mean, these are all new things. And so I think it's going to take a while before we catch up to the fact that, again, it's just not about K-12 stuff. It's lifelong. And mastering techno-literacy, mastering understanding how the Technium works and what it wants. And in the same way that, 100 or 200 years ago, people would be taught about nature and how the general principles the natural system would be, and how you would kind of find your way through that, and you would be guided, and you'd be taught, and you'd have some sense of the way in which things fit together. We don't have that for the Technium yet, but I think we will and we should develop that.
Now, you go into so much depth about what the Technium wants in your book. Obviously, it's there in the title. But what, from as far as you can see from this perspective, what do you think are some of the most important things somebody can understand now about what the Technium wants?
I think there are some pretty simple things that the Technium wants. One of the things that I would stress is one of the most obvious, indisputable aspects of what technology wants is that it's going to become more complicated. So anybody who's expecting some return to simplicity, I think is just going to be very disappointed. Things are going to become more complicated. They may superficially have an outside simplicity like the iPhone, which looks simplified, but it's not simplified. I mean, its use, again, you can swish your finger. That seems very simple, but once you start moving things around and once things start opening up, you realize this is very, very complicated. Everything will become more complicated, more complex over time, so that in 50 years from now, the technology is going to be it'll make now seem to be simple. And so we have to be ready for that complexity. And I say the complexity will approach the complexity of the natural world. And we have to understand, though, that we don't have to sort of understand the science of it all to use it. You and I have no idea how a tomato really works, but we can still grow tomatoes. We can even breed tomatoes without knowing how it really works. In the same way, the complexity of the Technium will continue to evolve. Well, we won't really understand things at all, but we can understand enough to use them. And so, making those distinctions, learning how to deal with that complexity that's beyond our understanding is going to be important. It will be so complicated that we won't be able to control it. That's another lesson. We don't control nature, but we can still use it, find it beautiful, and navigate through it. The technological structures and systems that we're going to make, we're not going to understand. That's okay. That's just the way it's going to be.
Have we ever controlled the Technium?
Well, I think early on, when we were making hammers and spears and bows and arrows, and when the Technium consisted of that, I think there was a sense that we, you made tools on demand. It was a disposable culture. You threw them away. It was far more controllable. At some point along the way, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where the scale of things became greater than human scale, when we started making systems that were larger than we were, we began to lose some control. And then when we introduced these little slivers of intelligence called chips and electrons and nerves, we certainly wired together something that is far beyond our control. And right now, in the beginning, that's sort of scary because you have something that you can't control. But in my calculus, it's only when we have things that we can't control that we actually get things that are really useful.
And the inference, or one of the inferences that I seem to find myself making from what you say in your book, is that it seems to me that the greater, the larger, the more advanced the Technium gets, or that we help it to get, the more any given individual can opt out of personal technology. Is that true?
There's two answers to that. But I would say that generally, advanced technology increases the options, and when it's done well, when it's convivial, it doesn't reduce too many of the previous options. But there is some reduction. I mean, however, for those who really want the old options, you want to live like a caveman, you can do that. I mean, tomorrow, you could get on a plane You could sell whatever clothes you have, and you could buy a ticket, and you could get on a plane, and you could fly to somewhere, and you start living like a caveman tomorrow if you wanted to. You're not going to, because you find out nobody really wants to, because you've reduced your choices tremendously. You could go live with the Amish, live like the Amish tomorrow if you wanted to. You can pick your options and your simplification and your earlier versions very easily. So we have the option to go back, but we usually don't, because we want more choices and options. We often go back just for a brief visit, like a sabbatical, and I think that's good. So, living on the beach for a week or hiking 2-week backpack, we have a chance to kind of temporarily reduce our choices, experience the simplicity and the unity and the integrity and the satisfaction that we have of living very simply like that. But then we come back because we realize we just can't live like that forever. And so that's what civilization offers, is increasing options, including the earlier options.
The chapter on the Amish that you have in the book is particularly fascinating because it seems to me, reading what you write about them, that as the Technium grows and offers more devices, the Amish they incorporate some of them into their lives, and some of them, like solar panels and things like that, have actually paradoxically allowed them to adhere more to their Amish goal of being off the grid. I mean, they have to, on the one hand, get solar cells from the Technium, but it also enables them to use the power grid and such less. I mean, is this 6 of one, half dozen of the other, or am I actually correct that they're somehow getting, with more technology, being able to fulfill their mission more?
All of us at this point are selecting out or using less technology or avoiding more technology than we use, and we're all basically neo-Amish in some senses of not using things, because there's just so many choices right now that we can't possibly use them all. So we are selecting. However, the differences between us and the Amish are two. One is the Amish select things collectively rather than individually, and secondly, they have a very clear criteria for how they make their selections. Most American individuals are just kind of, there's no rational criteria that they're trying to optimize by their selections, but the Amish are. What the Amish are trying to optimize are two things. They're trying to optimize their family cohesiveness and their community cohesiveness. So they're always asking about new technology. Does it keep my family together as a unit so that we can work in our backyard and stay at home? And does it increase the cohesiveness and strength and the binds of our community? So therefore, they rejected cars and kept the horse and buggy, because they found that with cars, people were going out of the community to shop or to visit or to go or to for recreation. If they had a horse and buggy, the maximum they could go would be 15 miles in any direction. And they were forced, in some senses, to visit the sick, shop locally, entertain and recreate within their neighborhood. And so that's why the horse and buggy has nothing to do about rejecting new things. It has everything to do with keeping the technologies that would reinforce their community or family. And so when genetically modified crops come along, they say, yeah, sure, we want those, because it allows us to use old-fashioned equipment and have the whole family harvest the corn rather than trying to have big harvesters, because the corn borers because the damaged corn doesn't make a difference to those harvesters. It does make a difference when you're doing it by hand. So they're perfectly fine in adopting new technologies if they encourage work at home and the family togetherness, and they encourage the community.
Since those criteria are fairly clear-cut then, or very clear-cut, you might say, about what technologies to adopt and what to reject on their part, I guess For you, there are certain technologies you use and you don't. Do you have a good idea of what your criteria are for technologies you'll accept and ones you'll reject?
That's a really good question. And the one thing I would say, again, about the choices that the Amish are making, by making these choices to maximize their leisure, their family and community, they do that at the price of giving up choices and options. So if you're going to be an Amish girl, if you're a girl and female in an Amish, your choice of what you do is singular. You're a mom, housewife. That's it. And if you're a guy, you can be a farmer or you can be a tradesman. You can't be a musician. You can't be a mathematician. You can't be a newspaper reporter. And so, they make that choice, and they say, yes, we understand that we're going to reduce our choices in order to maximize these other things. So, what am I doing with my selections? Yes, I think I'm. There's a little bit of that, but I'm not as deliberate as the Amish are. I am trying to minimize the amount of technology in my life that would maximize the choices for others. That's how I'm putting it these days. Is I'm interested in minimizing the technologies that affect my identity while maximizing the choices for others to find their identity. And so that means that, I try out a lot of stuff but don't hang on to it. So my style is sort of a little bit of, I'm a browser. I'm kind of trying things very fast just to understand them and try them, but not really keeping them. I'm not suggesting my choices to others, but that's what works for me. So, we don't have TV in our house. And I'm not texting and all that kind of stuff. Partly that's a generational thing, but partly I find that I don't need it, but I understand it. I have to do it, try it enough once or twice a year, whatever it is, to understand it. And I think that's also part of this new style, which is, and by the way, the Amish do this too, which is to try things knowing that you're not going to keep up with it, and then maybe even to try it later on. But trying becomes part of this new techno-literacy, which is that you have to have the ability to kind of try things, give it a fair shake, rather than just say, no, it's not for me.
This idea of selecting technologies that opens up options for others, of course, ties in with a theme of your book that I found very fascinating, that we have a moral obligation to create more technology, because that will essentially, tell me if I have this right, but creating more technology, advancing the Technium, that's a way to maximize human potential. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. So the image that I have is everybody born on Earth throughout history and currently has some uniqueness. It's reflected in the fact that our faces are somewhat unique, and I think the mix, the combination of various personality elements and skills and talents is also unique to some degree. And I think, to me, the life challenge for all of us is to, first of all, discover what our mix is, because it's not, we don't come with a kind of a plan or a manual or specifications. And so we have to spend our life, first of all, finding out what it is, and secondly, expressing it, finding the right opportunities to fully express those talents. And I see technology as the instrument for doing that. That the more choices we have, and this is what technology gives us, the more likely we are to find some way an opportunity to express those. And so, the horror is that people will be born geniuses in some capacity and never find the technology or the opportunity to express their genius. And so my little analogy, a little tale, is to imagine the loss to the world if Beethoven had been born before the invention of the technologies of the symphony or the piano. What a loss that would be. Or if Hitchcock had been born before the technologies of cinema. And you could name whatever one in the past, and it would be horrible, but there has to be today somewhere a child born whose genius may be unrevealed unless we invent the uninvented yet technology for them to express their genius. And therefore, for the sake of others' fulfillment, we are obliged to continually invent new opportunities for everybody.
When we talk about things like the moral obligation to invent more technology, or in the book and elsewhere, you talk about technology and computation and the internet and its effect on the sort of God metaphors that people use in their minds. It's this interesting, seems like a reintroduction of sort of religious concepts or language into the technological sphere, which is two spheres I hadn't thought of ever meeting. And do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I am saying that there is a spiritual dimension to technology, that it's not neutral, that the sum of it is tipped in the balance of good, just as we would say that, a child is not neutral, a child is good. And more importantly, it's just not that there's a single child, but that there's an arc through history, beginning at the Big Bang, and that arc is increasing complexity, increasing diversity, increasing sentience, increasing beauty, increasing choices, increasing energy efficiency. And all these things are going as it goes through life, and life accelerates all those trends. And then mind, as we get into humanity, accelerates all those trends in culture, and that our invention of technology are also doing the same thing of increasing diversity and specialization and complexity and sentience, and that humanity is not the end point by the longest shot, but we're actually a middle point, that this arc has preceded us and will continue beyond us, that we are in the middle of something that's going forward, and so that we are part of something very large. And the question is, well, what is it? And so I'm saying that technology is part of this larger thing, and this larger thing, we don't have very good names for it. I call it exotropic system. It's the converse of entropy, which runs down. This runs up. But what is it? And I think that what it is it's self-generation. It's autopoiesis. It's the self-creation. It's this ongoing lifelike force or mind-like force that runs through the universe, ever increasing in these qualities. And Ray Kurzweil, the atheistic singularitan, says that if you kind of describe the end point where all this is headed, it's exactly the same language that people use to describe God. This is an unanswerable question about what it is, but it does have that element of pointing to something, and it's running through the universe. And so what I'm saying is that technology is actually part of this bigger story, that it's that connected to the evolution of life and mind and the persistent disequilibrium of planets and galaxies, and that there's this grand story that we're part of, and that we can be part of, and that it's not cold, hard, iPod stuff. That it's actually this beautiful, long-term, 4 billion year journey, the immense journey, and that we're in the middle of it, and we're headed towards the end of it in another 4 billion years.
There's plenty of reasons, I think, to be optimistic about technology, especially after reading your book and listening to the arguments. But the fact that this line of thinking can reveal that, the religious and atheists alike are using maybe different terms for the same concepts. Can I hope for a certain amount of understanding and patching up of differences as a result of this, or is that too optimistic?
Well, yeah. So could this kind of a view bring together? Yeah, I think it's possible. I guess I would say I'm sympathetic to that. Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, who believed and argued fiercely that there was no trend in evolution, that there was no direction. I think he's wrong. But he also argued that there was, these two spheres were separate magisteria, he called it, separate realms that should not even meet, the science and the spiritual. I actually believe differently. I think there is a trend in biology and evolution and in the universe of the Technium, and that therefore speaks to the fact that those two realms are really not separate, and that we might have a chance to develop a vocabulary that would cross over between those two. So I am a little bit more sympathetic to that.
Certainly, we can hope. The book, again, is What Technology Wants. No subtitle on that. Kevin Kelly, thanks so much for taking the time.
It's been a real pleasure, Colin. I appreciate your great questions, and I am really delighted that you enjoyed the book.
If you'd like to find out more about Kevin Kelly and What Technology Wants, visit kk.org. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. If you'd like to hear this conversation again, visit colinmarshallradio.com, the official Marketplace of Ideas website, where you'll find our complete interview archive as well. Or go on iTunes, click on the iTunes Store, search for the Marketplace of Ideas, and there you'll find it, all the conversations on this show, free for the download. The website of Ben Althouse, the man who does our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com as well. And if you'd like to send any feedback along, questions, comments, suggestions of guests you'd like to hear on the show, send that to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That is Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. As always, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand.